On today's World Insight, this year marks the 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties between China and New Zealand. We speak to New Zealand Ambassador to China Clare Fearnley on how individuals and people-to-people exchange helped build bilateral ties.
Well, I think it was an important year because we managed to have consensus and to produce outcomes, and there have been disrupted years because of the pandemic in particular.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. 2022 marks the 50th anniversary of the diplomatic relations between China and New Zealand. Over the past 5 decades, the two countries have forged strong ties, both rooted in a shared past and an eye for the future. Bilateral free trade agreement, which took effect in the year 2008, was a step up for relations. China is now New Zealand's largest trading partner. China is also New Zealand's second largest and fastest growing tourism market, and the largest source of international students. With the Asia-Pacific region a pillar of global economic recovery, both countries are pushing for multilateralism. Both seek a coordinated response to global crises such as climate change and the pandemic. On these and more, I talked to Clare Fearnley, who is the ambassador of New Zealand to China. Good to see you in the embassy.
It's great to have you here.
What a beautiful place you have shown us today.
This is a very special room for us here at the embassy. We call it, it's a whare taonga, like a room of treasures, and it has a name, He Pakiaka, and it's a name from Māori language, the indigenous people of New Zealand.
Very impressive carvings.
Well, they were a wonderful gift from a fantastic group organised by Kiwi who visited here in the old embassy. This is a newly built embassy, and went home and organised a group of young carvers to carve these wonderful pieces. So when we built the new embassy, these were removed and taken home to New Zealand, restored, and then brought back into this room that's designed especially for them.
So the legacy of the past 50 years, really,
that's right,
is all here as well.
That's too true.
So thank you so much for this special arrangement. This year celebrates 50th anniversary between China and New Zealand diplomatic relations. Many wonder how much guts and courage, our earlier generations had in establishing these relations and continue it today in such strength.
Yeah, a very wise decision by the decision makers back in the early 70s. And you look now at how far the relationship has come. It's matured as a relationship. It certainly is multifaceted. In celebrating this 50th anniversary, we're focusing on 3 main areas, and the first one, not surprisingly, is people, tangata in Māori. But we're also looking at the planet and also prosperity. And so we've shaped a program of events to mark the 50th anniversary that picks up each of these 3 main themes. But it is a relationship that actually predates the 50th.
That's true.
And I look back to the very early arrivals into New Zealand from the Chinese community. So we think one of the earliest arrivals, Apo, was back in 1849. So that's quite early in the history of modern New Zealand. And he's believed to have more than 1,000 descendants now, 1,600 descendants in the country, who I understand get together from time to time to commemorate the arrival of their ancestor. But he established himself as a very successful beef and cattle farmer in New Zealand in the 19th century. There are many other stories like that. The Chu Chong, who came out to the Taranaki and was involved in the early days of the dairy industry in New Zealand, and also sending New Zealand products back to China. So there's a large Chinese Kiwi community. We think around close to 250,000, so 250,000 in New Zealand.
It is, and that is exactly the story between China and New Zealand. Well, you are talking about celebrating the diversity of New Zealand. China and New Zealand certainly has gone through quite a relationship in terms of building partnerships. Remember the legendary Rewi Alley. Many have just at the, as their story sessions almost every time when they mention about China and New Zealand. Their generation, how do you see, the dramatic changes their generation faced then? And apparently also some dramatic situations evolving in our generation, Madam Ambassador.
I think about the contribution that Rewi Alley in Chinese,
Rewi
Rewi Alley in English, has made. And certainly he had courage. I mean, he set off in 1927 when he first arrived in China. But to make that journey from New Zealand to China, that was a bold decision. And when he arrived in Shanghai, immediately threw himself into multiple areas of work. He lived all of his adult life in China from 1927 until he passed away in 1987, and throughout that time was a bridge between our countries as well. He made some return trips home, but always as a visitor. He saw his home as being in China. And I've had the opportunity to travel around and see some of the places where he worked and where he made contributions. He assisted communities, whether it was in technical training for young people or in flood relief in Hubei. He went over to Honghu several times to help with flood relief there. But one of the places he's perhaps most closely associated with is in Gansu, Jiangye, Shandan, the Shandan Bailey School.
The Gansu movement.
That's right, which is still going today, and we have contact with. It's still helping people in their developing their technical capabilities. But if COVID allows, that there's a plan for me to go out to Gansu, to Shandan the week after next.
I'm sure you have many friends there already.
Oh, well, look, there's a strong bond between particularly Rewi Alley's home region of New Zealand and Gansu. And so whenever I go back to Gansu, I really feel like, I'm just reaping the benefits of generations of connections.
Sometimes just personal stories like this give us a lot of strength, I should say, even though it's a very general word. How people in their generation be able to overcome all the challenges and aim at the right goal, in a way, to work with the people from the other side of the world. I really wonder, how is the situation now between China and New Zealand, for example, about trade, for example, about people-to-people relations, Madam Ambassador?
Well, looking back 50 years ago, the trade between our countries was tiny, very small figure. And looking today, we're looking at more than $37 million worth of trade both ways. And certainly the free trade agreement that was concluded in 2008 between our countries has had a significant impact, and the growth over that period, what are we now, 14 years of having the FTA in place, has been really significant and benefited both countries as well. And just this year in April, we concluded and brought into force an upgrading of the FTA, a new protocol to it that introduces some new chapters, things that we hadn't been able to conclude 14 years ago but now could, around issues like government procurement, e-commerce, environmental matters. So we've now got a modernised FTA that reflects the current state of economic links.
Where do you think the biggest strength might be about that updated version?
I think some of the new chapters are really significant. Of course, there was some additional market access achieved around forestry products and in the services sector, and those are significant too. But I do think it's great that we now have, for example, e-commerce covered I think that's very significant given, particularly during the COVID years, but even before that, it's become such an important platform. And it's a great equaliser. It means smaller companies that might find difficulty in establishing an in-market presence with bricks and mortar through e-commerce have an access that otherwise wouldn't be possible. So we're great fans of e-commerce connections.
You were deeply involved along the process from your perspective as a diplomat, but before you're being a diplomat, you are one of those very key negotiators for free trade agreement and also for a multilateral trade framework for your country. During this process of negotiation, Madam Ambassador, how do you see the two sides came to consensus?
Well, I think a lot of the things we've done subsequently together very much fit under the umbrella of multilateral negotiations and China's accession to the WTO. I think that was something that made the subsequent steps possible. So I look back to 2001 as a very significant year in the bilateral relationship, as well as being a significant year for China and the WTO, with China's entry into the WTO. And similarly, in a way, with APEC, we find multiple ways of working together in APEC. Last year was New Zealand's hosting year.
It was quite a success, despite of the challenges of the pandemic.
Well, I think it was an important year because we managed to have consensus and to produce outcomes, and there'd been disrupted years because of the pandemic in particular. So it was significant, and that's been continued on into this year, though there are some special challenges this year as well. The work within APEC has laid the foundation for our bilateral FTAs. It's laid the foundation for other regional agreements, and of course we look ahead to the future when hopefully APEC member economies can agree together on a free trade agreement of the Asia Pacific. That's something that I know both of our countries continue to look ahead to as a future goal.
Multilateralism, of course, is the key here when it comes to international and regional trade negotiations. Now, I know that concept is being challenged from time to time by certain members of the international community. As a seasoned diplomat and as a trade negotiator, how do you see that?
Well, I took a lot of heart from the successful conclusion of the WTO MC12, the ministerial meeting, just over a month and a half ago. Yeah, there was agreement about some issues that New Zealand has been actively advocating for over more than 10 years, closer to 20 years, for example, on fisheries subsidies. So we were very pleased to see that a consensus was possible around a new instrument addressing fisheries subsidies. I think there's a global recognition of the stress that our oceans are under. So this had a particular significance at this time. I think also it was great that there was agreement around intellectual property issues relating to COVID vaccines and other aspects of COVID. Very significant that there was consensus on that point. And I think also the agreement that was reached around a statement on emergency food supplies in the current global environment, again very significant. And that statement made clear that trade needed to remain at the centre of resolving food emergencies and food security for people, which again I think is a very important principle.
Now, under the current circumstances, with complex geopolitical situations as well as energy and food crisis in the world, which is already very apparent today, how do you see China and New Zealand, two very diverse countries, will be able to cooperate, as partners on the international stage and also in the region?
We've talked already about APEC, and I think that's a great norm preparing forum, a forum where our regulators can get together and where the discussion can happen that produces binding norms outside APEC, not within it. I think that's an important area of cooperation for our economies. We've worked together well within RCEP as well in getting the agreement negotiated and entered into force. Both of our countries were early ratifiers of RCEP. And I've talked too about how APEC and RCEP together we hope will lead to a region-wide free trade area of the Asia-Pacific eventually. So this gives us lots of scope to work together. I also look at the FTA work we've done. We've talked about that a little bit, but I think it sets a good example of how two economies of very different scale, of different economic and different political systems, can actually find a way to work together, further developing the rules-based system, at least as it applies bilaterally between our two economies within the region. I think that's all very positive. Yeah.
How do you see at this stage, when the natural disasters we're seeing throughout the summer around the world, clearly telling us the challenges of climate change, at this moment, how urgently can we work together?
Well, we have a good solid track record of cooperation in climate change between our two countries. When our Prime Minister visited China in 2019, Prime Minister Ardern and Premier Li Keqiang issued a joint statement on climate change cooperation. We have annual meetings between our climate change ministers to talk about the program ahead, and also how we work together in international negotiations. Our last meeting was just in a few weeks before the Glasgow conference of the parties last year, so there was a particular focus on Glasgow work. But there's also some very practical things that we can do together. New Zealand has had we're very lucky in that more than 80% of our electricity is generated sustainably in New Zealand, mainly by hydro, but also by solar and wind power, geothermal. So we're aiming for 100%, but the space we have to cover to get to 100% is a lot less for New Zealand than for many other countries. We're very fortunate. But we've had an emissions trading scheme in New Zealand for many years, and we're one of the few countries that's extended its ETS to cover sectors such as agriculture and also forestry. So there's a lot of interest in sharing information together about how do you incorporate a forestry sector into the ETS. China's initial approach has been to focus mainly on its industries. So it sort of puts a cost on carbon and then provides some provision for appropriately managed carbon reduction to be traded. So just, was it late last year or early this year, we had a really useful technical exchange on how do you apply an ETS to forestry systems, the methodology. Similarly, there's interest in New Zealand's sort of out ahead in applying an ETS to agriculture, which is quite tricky, but given the relevance of methane and other agriculture-related greenhouse gases, it's quite important that it is covered. New Zealand has no plans to turn itself into an electric vehicle producing superpower. That's not what we're planning to do. There's other areas that we have strengths, but probably not in mass manufacture of e-vehicles or hydrogen-powered options either. But we are likely to need to be fully interoperable with the major alternative vehicle producers, and China is certainly one of those. So we are looking forward to having practical discussions. It's a gradual process. We've set a hard target of 2050 of being carbon neutral. So dealing with the transport sector is an important part of us getting there. But we're quite optimistic. Certainly the increase in purchase of e-vehicles has been quite marked since the subsidisation program was introduced.
One could almost tell how much New Zealand pays attention to the biodiversity just by walking around in the embassy itself already demonstrate that. But Madam Ambassador, tell me more about the bilateral cooperation in this regard, the space and the potential.
Well, I think one of the lovely symbols of the lasting relationship between New Zealand and China is around our shared migratory birds. It's one of my pet issues, which I know we've discussed before. Well, I just think, they're international citizens, these birds. They rely on multiple countries in order to sustain their life cycle. There's a wonderful bird called the godwit that has its southern summers in New Zealand, But there's a Maori saying, a whakatauki, around a mystery. Who knows where the godwit nests? Because the godwit doesn't nest in New Zealand, and so people never saw where the godwit nested. Actually, it nests all the way up in Alaska. But to get to Alaska, when it's flying north, it stops off particularly along the Bohai and Yalujiangkou, and they restore themselves, they feed up on the estuaries and the edges of the water, and then they're strong enough to fly on to Alaska. So I do think that that's a beautiful symbol of multiple countries being involved, and we've gone to Dandong and Liaoning to have a look at where the godwits migrate through. And at a single moment you can see thousands of them swirling around, landing, taking off again. Very dramatic, but very important ecosystem to them, as is Alaska, where they actually nest and raise their young. But I think the most remarkable part of the godwit story is that they have the globally longest non-stop flight of any migratory species. They fly 13,000 kilometres without stopping from Alaska back to New Zealand. So on the way up, they stop to feed in the Yalujiang. On the way back, they don't. They just fly straight. And every year, we've got joint scientific programs monitoring them. They put tiny little sensors on the birds so that they can monitor where they go. And in fact, just in the last week, with the autumn coming, they're starting to set off from Alaska heading south. So we're getting the first news reports of the monitored birds. There is scope for formal cooperation as well, and just this year, as part of our 50th anniversary celebrations, we jointly established together the New Zealand Department of Conservation and China's National Forestry and Grassland Administration vice ministerial level dialogue around better understanding the health of the population, the health of the ecosystem, the needs of the birds. And not just, I've mentioned one species, there's actually other species as well. The red knot does a similar flight up through to Siberia and then back again. But we're very keen to carry that forward, and there's enthusiasm here on the China side as well.
Madam Ambassador, I really wondered, what was it like for you? What has it been like for you to be able to see China at different stages, to be able to make friends in China and maintain a long-lasting relationship with them throughout the past few decades?
I was lucky enough. I started off in Xi'an teaching.
When you were like? Very
young. I was in my early 20s and had a wonderful time in Xi'an, and then had a scholarship after a year and a half in Xi'an to study at the Xi'an in Beijing. Now it's the Language and Culture University, and then had another year at Beida. And so it's always a great delight to go back to Beida. It's like visiting home and revisiting my youth. I'm old enough to be thinking about revisiting my youth.
Forever young, by the way.
For me, my first exposure to China was Xi'an in 1985. And the change, even in Xi'an itself, is huge, but also in the rest of China, just profound. So, you know, my first identification with China was in the culture of Shanxi, you know, not far from Bingmayong and Huaqingchi and
terracotta warriors, and it's a capital city of many dynasties in China.
And at that stage, I didn't really understand the dynastic history. That came to me later, but I could still see it was a very ancient town. So I saw that as defining China for me. So I had a lot to learn. You know, then I moved to Beijing and encountered a different culture, and then to Shanghai and a different culture there as well. All China, but you know, with distinct local flavour, and also the economic changes are huge. The economic choices that people have today would have been unimaginable to friends and colleagues in Xi'an in the mid-80s.
What is China to you? You know, how do you see the different layers of it to you, or of her to you?
Being able to engage with our region, being able to engage with China is crucial for New Zealanders, and particularly for young New Zealanders, I think. I think one of the challenges of this last 2.5 years is that our young people, and our, academics, journalists, officials, business people have not been able to move as freely. So I'm looking ahead to a time when that sort of freedom of movement will be possible again. For New Zealand's part, we opened our doors. We've been progressively opening our doors in the course of 2022 after being closed for COVID reasons pretty much for 2 years and successfully keeping COVID out of the country effectively. But this year Omicron evaded our defences and established itself in New Zealand. But we used that period when we were closed to get our vaccination levels up very high. So we got them up to 96% of all adults over 12, and even higher for our elderly folk. So we've now thrown open the doors again. So one of our messages here in China is when China's ready, we're ready for re-engaging in person with China, and in the interim we'll continue to use virtual means and other ways of keeping together. But the reason I go into that is I just think those human connections are so important. They've been crucial in my professional career and my personal life. So I look forward to a time when we can once again see young Kiwis, as we call ourselves, coming back to China, having this sort of experience and opportunity around language and culture and history that I had.
Lastly, Madam Ambassador, the Mid-Autumn Festival is coming up later this week. We would love to wish you a happy Mid-Autumn Festival and also hopefully a reunion with your loved ones.
我也祝你那个中秋快乐吧。
谢谢。
It's wonderful that that thought that we can all watch the moon together and be united wherever we are in the world. I just think that's a beautiful picture.
In the allure of the moon. Thank you so much.
非常感谢。
And that's my interview with the New Zealand ambassador to China, Clare Fearnley. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now.